Hey, this is Victor Antonio with another sales ride-along where you ride along and I talk about sales. Hey, today I want to talk about something known as the fundamental attribution error. And then I'm going to tie it in how it applies to selling and why it's so important for us to understand what it really is. The fundamental attribution error, I guess the best way to explain it is to give you an example. So here was an example that was in the book by Stephen Covey, if you remember, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And in there was a great story about a man. He's on a train, right? Riding along on a train. He has 3 kids. And the kids are just bouncing all over the train, basically disturbing all the passengers, just kind of really making a lot of noise. You know what I'm talking about. Eventually, one of the riders, a lady, a passenger, finally just can't take it anymore. And basically says to the man, excuse me, sir. And the guy wasn't really paying attention. Excuse me, sir, but do you know that your kids are disturbing all the other passengers on the train? Can you do something about it? And the man just kind of, wakes up and kind of looks over at the kids and sees them bouncing around, looks at the lady, and then he says the following. He says, I'm really sorry that they're doing that. We just come back from the hospital, and where their mother just died, and I'm trying to figure out how to tell them this. Now, at that point, the lady who scolded him basically looks at him in, pretty much horror, saying, I didn't know. And all of a sudden, the lady went from being mad at him to being sympathetic to his position and understood why he was off in a daze not paying attention to his kids. Now, see, in that very moment, just when she explained, or he explained, why he wasn't paying attention, the lady had a paradigm shift. That is called the fundamental attribution error. See, sometimes when we're looking at something, we think it is something. We see it in a certain way, and it isn't really what's happening. In other words, the lady looked at the kids bouncing all over the place. She thought that the father was just being indifferent, didn't care, and just wasn't paying attention, right? But that wasn't the case. The real point was that he was basically distressed. He was thinking something else about something else, and he wanted to basically know how to tell his kids that their mother had just died. So it wasn't that he was trying to be rude or insensitive. He was just somewhere else. And the lady now understood that. Now, that's a fascinating way of shifting somebody's perspective, right? And the fundamental attribution error plays out in our lives all the time. Let me give you an example. Do you ever call a customer up? You call a customer up, you leave a voicemail. And, we hate leaving voicemail. Sometimes it just doesn't sound right, if you know what I mean. But you leave the voicemail anyway. And the customer doesn't call back the next day. 2-3 days later, they still haven't called back, and now you're getting mad because they haven't returned your phone call. And then you call again, and sure enough, another day passes by, they still haven't returned your phone call. By the week, I guess the end of the week or the following week, you're pretty much upset. You're like, why haven't they called me back? You start questioning yourself. What did I do wrong? Then you start blaming them. Well, lousy customers, you start blaming them for not getting back to you. 2 weeks goes by, and all of a sudden you get a call from the customer. And the customer says, I apologize for not returning your phone call. I was out of the country because we had a death in the family, and I was really out of touch, and I was out of the country. And at that point, instead of being mad at the person, the client, now you're sympathetic because you go, oh, I didn't know that. But for those 2 weeks, you were basically superimposing your feelings on them, basically saying they're not considerate, they're not being, responsive. One of the best definitions of anger I've ever heard was when people don't behave the way you expect them to behave. Now think about that, anger. What's anger? When people don't behave the way you expect them to behave. So when somebody doesn't return your phone call right away, you're thinking, well, that's not the right way to behave, and you get angry. Now, what happens is that when we superimpose these beliefs, what we think is happening, what happens is we psych ourselves out. And by that I mean, we kind of says, well, maybe I said something wrong. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe they really don't want to buy our product. Well, maybe I'm disturbing them, or maybe I'm bothering them. Maybe I'm calling too much. And you start going through all this machination in your head, right? It's like a, Rube Goldberg machine in your head. You're just kind of thinking of all these things and all these reasons why they may not be calling you back. But it may simply be the case that they're out of the country, basically, because there was a death in the family. And we do this a lot. We superimpose what we think is happening, and that, in a sense, is the fundamental attribution error. So the next time you find yourself, telling yourself, why isn't this person calling me back? Why are they, doing the things they're doing? Here, I'll give you one more example. This happens a lot to me. You're in a meeting, right? You're doing a presentation. You think you're doing a hell of a job, and you're doing a presentation. All of a sudden, the key player gets up and leaves the room. And you're like, what the heck? Now, in your mind, you're trying to do the presentation, but in the back of your mind is like, what's going on? Did I say something wrong? Did I do something wrong? Maybe they're not interested. And so all of a sudden, you got all these concerns in your head while you're trying to do the presentation, but you plow through the presentation, you get through it, but later on you find out that had nothing to do with your presentation. They had another meeting planned, and they only planned to stay in your meeting for 15 minutes. So they weren't being rude, they just had something else planned. And they already had assigned somebody else in the room to give them the notes, basically covering the things they were going to miss. You get the idea? But in our brains, we superimpose what we think is happening. Maybe they didn't like our presentation. Maybe they're not interested in buying. It had nothing to do with that. Everything to do with they had something else planned. But the fundamental attribution error kicked in, and our alarms went off, and all of a sudden we kind of psyched ourselves out. Are you starting to get the idea of what the fundamental attribution error is? It happens in our personal lives. We superimpose what we think is happening when it's not really there. And we psych ourselves out. Sometimes we work ourselves up into a frenzy. We get mad when really there's no reason to get mad. We just need to be a little more patient. So next time a customer does something that's unexpected, and your immediate reaction is to probably either get mad or maybe be insecure about what's happening, maybe stop and ask yourself, is there another reason that the person reacted or behaved the way they did? And therefore, you start to kind of comb the fundamental attribution, kind of put it under control, and maybe later on you'll find out that it had nothing to do with you. It had everything to do with them. This is Victor Antonio on another Sales Ride Along, reminding you, selling ain't hard when you know how. Take care. See ya.